Hey, I'm Bart, and welcome to Momentum. We're so glad you've chosen to join us. Two things I'd love to make you aware of. One, we'd love to get to know you more and connect with you, and it's really easy to do. Just go to momentumcc.org/connect. There's a digital connect card, and we'd love to get to know who you are so you can get to know us a little better. And if you feel led in any way to give to what God is doing here at Momentum, it's really easy to give online. It's momentumcc.org/giving. Well, we're currently in a series called Heroes of the Faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, it lists all these names from the Old Testament that we kind of call the heroes of the faith. And we're going to take a look at each of those stories and really see, hey, what can their faith teach my faith? How can their faith encourage my faith? We hope you enjoy today's message.
Good morning. Well, I have one of those same voices along with Chad and our students. I got to go with our students this week, and man, it was just an incredible week. So thankful for Chad and Heather and just even all the volunteers who went. And just one of the coolest things for me was just watching, our students from both campuses just really come together. And they were really just momentumcc. I mean, they weren't Forsyth. It was awesome. And just, man, the theme was, I echo with Chad, like I got challenged and taught as much as our students did. But it was so great. And if you've got a student that age, I encourage you to have them go next year. It was just, it was an incredible week. So, and we celebrate the 5 baptisms. Then we've got 3 right now scheduled for second hour here, 6 at Forsyth. And again, if you're stirring, I want to echo what Chad's doing. Come talk to us. Don't wait. We'd love to see you step into that journey of faith with Jesus. Hebrews 11, 1 through 3 is where I started us last week when I talked about Samson. I want to start there again because the author of Hebrews kind of gives us this definition of faith. He says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. And last week I kind of gave this little definition of faith, saying that it's allowing the unseeable truth of God to determine your seeable steps. So in simpler terms, with this idea, maybe you've heard this, we walk by faith, not by sight, right? It's this idea and understanding, hey, my faith is saying that God, you see a bigger picture than I see, right? You know something's going on bigger than maybe even my life and how my life will play into that. Well, as we dive into Sarah this morning, I want to give you even a little more specific definition of faith that kind of goes along with her story. The first is this: the beginning point of faith is believing in God's character, that he is who he says he is, right? I'm going to believe this is God's character. He is who he says he is. The end point of my faith is believing in God's promises, that he will do what he says he's going to do. And so when we believe, hey, God's going to fulfill his promises, even if I don't see that promise materialize yet, or even if I never see that promise materialize in my life, that I am demonstrating true faith, right? I believe that God is working and moving. He is who he says he is, and he will do what he says he will do. Well, Hebrews 11 that we've been teaching through all summer is this idea of, it's kind of the Hall of Fame of faith. We get this list of the heroes of the faith. And our hope has been, hey, how can we learn from their faith? How can we be challenged by their faith? And maybe how can we avoid some of the mistakes that they made? And so today, we're going to talk about a woman named Sarah. And in Hebrews 11, 8 through 12, we get introduced to her and her husband. It says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. So God says, hey, Abraham, I've got this thing for you to do. I'm going to send you to this place. And Abraham steps into that, not even knowing where he's going. And by faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many of the stars of heaven and as many of the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And so we see this picture of Abraham and Sarah. They're the only married couple that are mentioned in Hebrews 11. Sarah is the first woman that is mentioned in Hebrews 11. And what we're going to see in her story is a word that all of us probably wrestle with and struggle with. Waiting. Waiting. I don't know if there's anything harder for all of us to do than to wait. Whether we're expecting something good, whether we're expecting something bad, or whether we're just expecting something unknown, the waiting is difficult. Abraham is 75 years old when he first received God's promise. In Genesis 21, it says that he was 100 when Isaac was born, and Sarah was 90. So the couple waits 25 years for the fulfillment of God's promise. Now, it's interesting, when somebody's pregnant, right, what do? We talk in months and weeks and days. That's what we do. So if you're waiting 25 years, that's 300 months. That's 1,300 weeks. That's 9,125 days. That's how long Sarah waits between hearing the promise of God and holding her baby in her arms. Now, let me give you some backstory, okay? Because first, when we meet this couple, they are Abram and Sarai, okay? Their names have not been changed yet. And so Sarai begins her life. She lives in kind of this pagan world called Ur. It's the land of the Chaldees. You and I would know this today as modern-day Iraq. Now, Sarah, it's a little interesting here, okay, was the half-sister as well as the wife of Abraham, Abram, as we know right now. Sarah and Abram have the same father, but they have different mothers, according to Genesis 20. And I know we look at that and we go, dude, what is up with that? Like, right? That's a little weird. But in those days, okay, genetics are a little purer, right? Intermarriage was not as detrimental to offspring between relatives, okay? Also, they tended to spend their lives, clustered together in these family units. That's how you lived and traveled, right? And so it was natural for many of them to choose mates from within their own tribes and families, okay? And what I love about this story is that when Abram and Sarai encountered the living God for the first time, they just simply believed. They didn't know a lot about God. They didn't know really, they hadn't spent years studying him. They just believed. Genesis 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I'll make of you a great nation, and I'll bless you, and I'll make your name great so that you'll be a blessing. Genesis 12, verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions they gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. And so Abram and Sarai leave their home, everything they know. Everything that they've known, all that they've gained and had, what they could pack up and they go. And they're living as pilgrims, they're as aliens, they're in tents, and they're traveling. And they're all this time, they're just believing in a promise that's going to be fulfilled in future generations. So they leave and they do this, but all along they've got this, the key thing here is they've got this heavenly focus, right? We're going to put our faith in God, whether we see all this play out or not, and we're just going to keep a heavenly focus. One major problem, right? The promise is that your children are going to be all generations. I'm going to make a people out of you, and you're going to be as many as the number of the stars in the skies. Sarai couldn't have children. I mean, think about that, right? We know the woman's role in that, in childbirth and bearing children, right? That's an important identity thing. In this culture, that would have been everything to her. It was carrying on the family line. That was her identity as a wife and a mother. Plus, God has already promised their descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky. Genesis 15. And he brought him outside. He brought Abram outside. And he said, look toward the heaven and number the stars. If you're able to number them, then he said, so shall your offspring be. So Sarai's got to be asking, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? I know in a room like this, I know some of you have walked this journey of infertility. That's some of Jody and I's story. Now we're kind of a little different story because we do have a biological son. Keaton was born. He was our firstborn, and it was a difficult pregnancy. It was a long process, but he was born healthy. And then about a year and a half later, we got pregnant again, but we had a miscarriage. And then as we kind of healed from that and walked more in the next couple of years, we went on this journey where we could not get pregnant. We went and you started investigating what's on. There were some issues and some things going on. And so then it was this struggle of a couple more years of how do we walk through this infertility thing? Now we had a blessing. I know we live in a little different story because we had a biological son who was probably more of a miracle than we ever knew. But we walked this journey of infertility. It led us to adoption. But I remember the difficulty, the emotions, the pain, the wondering, the waiting during that period. The personal and the cultural shame for Sarai, it would have been huge, huge. And Abraham and Sarai probably started worrying and wondering, how are we going to fulfill this promise? How are we going to fulfill what God has said to us? But God has promised, and God is faithful. And he gave them a vision for their descendants. Because, right, if you grew up in church, you know it's true because you sang Father Abraham, right? Who had many sons, and many sons of father. And if you don't know that, we're just weird church people, right? I know, all right? But we sang that song because God promised them the land and descendants in Canaan. The problem was that Sarai remained childless. And here's what I know to be true is that doubts surface when hope fades. Doubts surface when hope fades. And years passed, and with them, Sarah's laughter and her joy would turn to sorrow and longing, right? Because she yearned for a child. She yearned to be a part of the solution to God's promise. But that began to fade. God had made this promise, but she's starting to doubt. I've been waiting, and it starts to feel like her hope fades just like a desert flower would in the scorching sun. And the delayed promise and the waiting caused Sarai to do something that we all do so often, that often in the waiting what we do is we take matters into our own hands. And so what she does is she convinces Abraham. She goes, Abram, I've got an idea. Why don't you have a child with our servant girl? And maybe God will bless our descendants through this child, she thought. But that's not what God intended, right? Sarai matters. She's part of the promise. She's part of the story. She's part of God's plans, his good plans. And it is through Abram and Sarai that the promise will come. It's not just Abram. She's a part of it. But 25 years have passed since God promised descendants. And now Sarai is 89 years old. She's barren and she's desperate. And so following some cultural norms, she suggests, hey, Abram, why don't you have a child with our servant girl Hagar? And that child born will be counted as ours. And Abram agreed, and Hagar conceived a son named Ishmael. But Sarai began to look at Hagar and the coming baby with contempt, and she began to treat Hagar harshly, so much that Hagar ran away, like, I don't want to be a part of this. And God meets Hagar in the desert and encourages her to return back to Abram and Sarah, which she did. And 13 years after Ishmael is born, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham. He wanted to, hey, Abram, I haven't forgotten you. In fact, I'm going to give you a couple things, right? First is the sign of circumcision. I'm sure Abram was like, hey, could we do it another way? But this is what we do, right? And then he even changed their names. This is where he steps in. And I love this part because he's Abram, meaning the high father. But God's going to change his name to Abraham. That means what? The father of multitudes. I'm reminding you of my promise, Abraham. And Sarai, your name has met my princess, But I'm going to change you to Sarah, which is the mother of nations. I'm reminding you of my promise of who I am and that I do what I say I'm going to do. So God told Abraham, I'm going to give you a son through Sarah, and through this son, Isaac, this would be the one that would establish his covenant and fulfill the promise. Now, God wasn't leaving out Ishmael. God would bless Ishmael, but Isaac was who the promise was going to come through. It's who the nations would be blessed. And it's interesting because Isaac means he laughs. Abraham laughed at 100 years old that he could have a son with Sarah, who was 90 years old, who had been barren her entire life. She laughed at the prospect too. But God remained faithful to his promise to give Abraham and Sarah a son. Genesis 21, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, who Sarah bore him, Isaac. I mean, think about that. Sarah is now a mother at the age most women are grandmothers and great-grandmothers. But her faith has been rewarded. And now her tent is filled with joyous laughter of a child. And even though Sarah doubted, God demonstrated his faithfulness by providing a son for her. They named him Isaac, and Sarah said this in Genesis 21, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. It's interesting because before Sarah laughed with disbelief, she laughed in secrecy. This is never going to happen. And now Sarah laughed with joy, and she wants her story to be known. God had been faithful to his promise and blessed her. Now, as Isaac grows, there begins to be some tension between Sarah and Hagar and the sons. Sarah would insist that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away, fearing that maybe Ishmael could be a threat to Isaac's inheritance. And Abraham reluctantly agreed, and Hagar and Ishmael were cast out into the wilderness. But God still had a promise for Ishmael. The Bible goes on and kind of traces both lineages of Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac becomes the father of Jacob, who is later known as Israel, and whose descendants become the nation, the people, the Israelites. Ishmael, on the other hand, will have 12 sons who become the heads of various tribes. And what's interesting, if you don't know, that this is the roots of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. Isaac and Ishmael are often used symbolically to represent the broader conflict between Jews and Arabs, Israeli and Palestinians. And I think, when we step into something like this, you have to recognize that in a conflict like this, it's complex, right? It has so many geopolitical levels with so many dimensions. And I think sometimes we want to reduce it solely to just the biblical narratives. Hey, this is Isaac and Ishmael. So what? It's because that can oversimplify sometimes the complexities of a situation like this, right? This conflict is because a range of factors. Historical events, nationalism, territorial disputes, political ideologies, genuine hate for other people, and so much more. But what I need you to see, that even in spite of all that, the religious and historical story of Isaac and Ishmael has played a role in shaping the perspectives and identities of those who are in that conflict. All of this from a decision that Sarah made. Sarah was simple. She was beautiful, but she was a very human woman, and she made mistakes like all of us do. She stepped ahead of God and tried to handle her business on her own, foolishly, by sending her handmaid to Hagar to Abraham to bring forth a child that God had already promised. And in doing so, she ignited a feud that has lasted for 4,000 years. And as the years passed, Sarah watched her son grow into a young man, and she continued to live a life of faith because she knew her story was not just about the miracle of Isaac's birth, but it was a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness. It was a powerful reminder that all things are possible with God, right? That's where in Genesis 18 it says, is anything too hard for the Lord? And it says Sarah lived another 30 years and died at the age of 127. So what does Sarah's story mean for us? What does her faith say to us? I think she is an example of a holy woman who hoped and trusted in God. Sarah, think about it. She willingly left her home, everything she knew, and stepped out with Abraham to follow this kind of unknown God, whom they were kind of unfamiliar with at that time, but they said, hey, we're in. She tried as much as she could to provide an heir for her husband. There's some other stories which are pretty incredible in their stories where she even worked to keep her husband safe in dangerous lands. But in the end, she had enough faith to know that she and her husband, at the ages of 90 and 100, would give birth to a promised heir named Isaac. And although she lived in a world of danger and confusion and waiting, she stood firm to her commitment to her husband and to God. So I think Sarah's life reveals a pretty incredible faith. It was a faith that enabled her to bear a child. It was a faith that turned her laughter of doubt into laughter of joy. And her legacy of faith lives on, right? We're reading about it. We're talking about it today. That God can do what he says he's going to do, and he is who he says he is. And even when the circumstances say it doesn't look like it can happen. She waited 25 years. But the delay was part of her journey. The waiting was part of her story. And for God, her age was never an obstacle. When all possibilities of human conception were gone, all hope had faded, the only answer was God. And his timing is always perfect. So now Sarah is a hero of the faith. She became the mother of a nation. She's an ancestor of Jesus. She's the first woman listed in Hebrews 11. I love Hebrews 11:11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. That's the line I love there. She considered him faithful who had promised. God is who he says he is, and he will do what he says he will do. It's not always easy for them to believe. It's not always easy for you and I to believe. But God honored them for their faith. But the waiting. And some of you this morning, that's where you're at. You're in this place where you just feel like you're waiting. God, I need an answer. God, I want an answer. God, would you speak? Would you move? Would you lead? Would you give me a sign? I'm waiting, and I know that is so hard. But here's what we do. It's what we've learned from Sarah, right? One way we cope with the waiting, even if it's a long wait or if it's a short one, is that we begin to think, I can help put God's plan into action. And Sarah tried that approach. From her point of view, she felt like, hey, I've got to step in here. I've got to get Abraham a son some way or another, right? And it seemed to work at first, but I can only imagine the regret that Sarah had for the day that she decided, I'm going to push God's timetable forward. Let me ask you a question. Have you tried taking things into your own hands because you've had trouble waiting on God's timing? Another way we cope, and we see this with Sarah, another way we cope with the waiting is that we start gradually believing that what we're waiting for is never going to happen. It's never going to happen. I know God said that, but I don't think it's going to happen. I don't believe it. Sarah waited 90 years. 90 years. Is there any part of your life that feels like it's on hold right now? Do you understand that actually the waiting might be exactly what God has for you? That that's the most important part of the journey? That that's a big piece of his plan for you? Is there something that you've just given up hope on with God? God, I just don't think it's going to. Just be honest with God. Let him know how you feel. He's got pretty thick skin, right? He wants to hear from you. But what I would say, would you be willing to wait on his timing and his answer? Because even if it feels like nothing's happening, even if it feels like everything's at a standstill, even if you feel like, hey, God's doing nothing, I'm not hearing anything, he's not answering anything, I'm praying, I'm doing all things, even if you feel that way, here's what I would tell you in the waiting. The Bible still has enough direction to keep you busy, even while you're waiting for some particular part of your life to move forward. And what we do sometimes is we freeze. But God is so clear. I've got things for you to do even while you're waiting. There are good works for you. There are good plans for you to walk in even while you wait. One I would say is you need to know God's promises. That's what we cling to in the waiting times. Do you know his promises? You got to be in the Word. You've got to be in your Word. You got to be in prayer and communication with God. Let God know how you feel. Let him know what you're wrestling and struggling with. And then here's what I would say is shut up. Get quiet and listen. Because sometimes we're literally talking so much that we never stop to hear what he has to say. And then I would say it's be in community with others. We talked about this a little bit last week with Samson. That Samson tried to go everything solo. And that's never God's design, is that when we're weak, that there's other people who step in who have the strength. And sometimes God is actually speaking through others what you need to hear. And if you're in the waiting, here's what I would say. Do your work. Serve your family. Love your neighbors, right? At Momentum here, we talk a lot about your one. That's the person you're praying for. You're hoping that maybe that you'll get a conversation with them about Jesus someday. That maybe you'll get to share your story. That maybe there'll be a moment that you get to invite them to church. Pray for your one. Serve your one. Serve and love the lost and the left out and the left behind. Use your gifts to build the church. Be generous. Share the gospel, right? Especially in your actions, and if necessary, use words. But there are things for you to do while you're in the waiting. Don't just freeze. And you know what? When we look at these stories, and I know that God puts these stories to encourage our faith, but also to challenge our faith. And so one thing we can do is look at Sarah's weaknesses. Look at her mistakes. You don't have to experience the same thing. She had trouble believing God's promises for her. Maybe that's you. She attempted to work out the problems without consulting God. And she tried to cover up her own failures by blaming others. So this morning, let me give you some truths to hang on to. If you're in the waiting, when God calls us in faith, to step out in faith and to follow him into the unknown and the unfamiliar territory, it requires us to follow him just one step at a time. Today, just take one step. Tomorrow, take one step. How long we wait on God is directly proportional to how much we trust him. Much we trust. God responds to faith even in the midst of failure. God is not bound by what usually happens, but he can stretch the limits and he can cause unheard of events to happen. And then this was the last one. The impossible situations in life cause us to exercise our faith. You know, we've been in the moments we can talk about all the good and exciting things, but we forget the journey. You know, Momentum's in a great place right now where we're just probably weeks, if not a month or so away from breaking ground at Forsyth, building a brand new facility for that campus on 27 acres that we paid cash for. Here, we're dreaming right now and thinking about what's next for this campus. And in the midst of it, God gave us 3 acres beside us, but we're still kind of just saying, hey, God, what do you want us to do here? What do you have for us here in McDonough? Can I tell you that just a little over a year and a half ago, myself and Seth and some of the other leaders were sitting and we were asking ourselves, God, what do you want us to do? We don't know what to do. Our Forsyth campus is in a rented space that is we are busting out the walls. We share parking with several businesses. We don't have any space or where to go. Everything's been a dead end. Here at McDonough, we were feeling, things are starting to pick up again, but what do we do? Do we stay put here? Do we move? And then the question was simply, how would we finance any of this? That's where we were. It was a desperate kind of thing. It was like almost the waiting, God, you've put us here for 16 years. What do we do? And in a year, he has moved and shown up to where we bought 3 acres here with cash. We bought 27 acres for Forsyth with cash. We're dreaming, and God is moving. There's been incredible generosity. There's a couple of praying. It's like God saying, hey, I'm faithful. Right? I'm God. I am who I say I am, and I will do what I'll say. Are you going to trust me? Are you going to have faith? And here's what I know. I'm starting to kind of pray, just God, keep it up. And if we have to wait some more longer for those kind of answers, I'm into the waiting. You know what I mean? So let me give you a few questions. How will you respond when God calls you to step out in faith and follow him? What would be your response? Can you wait on God's timing in your life? Are you able to trust him for the impossible? Are you truly, when you're walking, are you looking forward and focused on the heavenly home? Or if you were honest, are you kind of settled right here in the right now? And if God is leading you to step out in a specific area, my question is, how are you responding? And if you can't remember all those questions, here's 2 questions that I often say to people a lot. It makes it real simple. What do I think God is saying to me, and what am I doing about it? What do you think God is saying to you right now, and what are you doing about it? My prayer, our prayer, is as we study the life of Sarah, as we study the life of all the heroes of the faith this summer, is that you would just give your heart completely to God. That is true faith. That is the core of faith. Like, God, I'm yours. No matter where you lead, no matter where you take me, no matter what you ask, no matter what you do or what you don't do or how long I have to wait, my heart is yours. And then our prayer is that you would trust him in obedience for whatever he asks you. That you would believe he is faithful, and that you would look forward to your eternal home and understand that you're just passing through here. So when we see the trials and we see the uncertainties and we feel the weight of waiting, that we would look at stories like Sarah and go, if she can do that, I can do it. I can walk in faith. We may have doubts about how God can use us. We may have doubts about what God's going to do, but can we remain faithful? Here's what I know to be true. Faith is not a one-time decision. It is a daily choice. And you're going to have to wake up tomorrow and say, God, I'm going to be faithful. And you're going to have to wake up Tuesday and say, God, I'm going to be faithful. And you're going to have to wake up Wednesday and say, God, I'm going to be faithful. It's about trusting God even when the path is unclear and all human possibilities have faded. I love that line by Sarah in Hebrews 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. She considered him, God, faithful because he had promised. Here's what I see today is that so many people want to be influencers, right? They want to be influencers, right? If I can get enough followers, if I can get enough subscribers, right, I can influence people. And then I'll get some sponsorship and I'll get some advertising and maybe I'll make a lot of money. And people will go to all kinds of links to create content that's going to attract other followers. Can I tell you something? Sarah was an influencer. She's still influencing you and me today. And it wasn't because she had a large number of followers. It was because she simply followed. By faith, she followed the one who is faithful. So where are you at today? Are you in that waiting? What would it look like for you to remain faithful? And maybe you're here today and you're like, hey, I'm just kind of checking this God thing out. But something's happened, something's stirring. Maybe that step you need to take today is say, God, I need you. Jesus, I can't do this without you. I don't fully understand, but my way has not been working. I need to make a change. God, I want to follow you. I need Jesus to be the Savior of my life. I mean, I even think I need to respond publicly to that. I want to get baptized. I mean, I know we schedule baptisms, but you can do it today too. Like, do it in your clothes. We don't care. We got towels for you. I got some shorts back here. We'll get you some shorts and a t-shirt, right? if God is leading you, what is God saying to you, and what are you doing about it? And if God's saying today's your day to take that step of faith and follow Jesus, we'd love nothing more than for you to do that. Would you pray with me? Lord, would you just teach us from the life of Sarah? I pray that you'd give each of us a willing heart that is willing to step out in faith and trust you. God, help us to trust you even when we don't understand, even when we're in the waiting. Help us to believe that you are the God of the impossible. Is anything too hard for you? And God, would you show us some of the temporary things or the earthly things that have gotten a hold of us and taken our focus away from the eternal? And God, would you give each one of us a faith that nothing is impossible with you? It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us, and we sure hope you enjoyed today's message. Again, we'd love to connect with you. It's real easy, momentumcc.org/connect. And if you feel led to give, it's momentumcc.org/giving. And two things that helps you stay up to date on our current content is simply subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us through our podcast. Again, thanks for joining us.